Hello, and welcome to part one of Tough Conversations with CxOs, a podcast all about how businesses can be really intentional about their ways of working and be more responsive to what's going on in the market. I'm Alexis Williams, Head of Strategic Alliances at Atlassian. I'm here with Steve Davis of Accenture, and today we are joined by special guest Ken Spangler, Executive Vice President of IT, CIO Global Operation Technologies at FedEx. And together, we're sitting down live at the FedEx World Hub in Memphis, Tennessee. What a beautiful day to be here in Memphis, in a FedEx hangar, no less. Thank you for joining, Ken. Thank you for joining, Steve. I'm excited about our conversation today. You guys want to do a little intro?
Sure. Yeah, it is a beautiful day here in Memphis. I remember the first time I came in 2008. It was wonderful to meet some new FedExers, but I've been working with FedEx as a coach and consultant for since 2008, so 15 years now. So I think I bleed purple, and it's always great to be here, especially with the people, and developed a great working relationship and a friendship with Ken.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having us. And Ken Spangler, Executive Vice President of IT. I run the Global OpCo Technology Group at FedEx. And I'll say, yes, it's a beautiful day, but it's always a beautiful day when you're sitting here looking at a FedEx wide-body aircraft in a hangar. And, you know, I've been around, like I said, almost 34 years, but every time I'm in any of our hubs, but especially this, our, Memphis hub, I get amazed, even as a FedExer who's been around this long.
Yeah, this is pretty special. We do quite a few podcasts between the Accenture and Atlassian partnership, and I have to say this is one of the better, more awesome experiences we've had. So thank you so much for having us. I want to share kind of to start off like what my favorite thing about FedEx is. It's obviously a world-renowned brand. I just love that when I order my fancy expensive shoes, you guys get it to me on time. That's a huge deal. Steve, what comes to mind when you think about the FedEx brand?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is the people. I know that they care about me, and I know that I care about making their lives better. But in addition to that, I go back to the old, one of the old brand sayings, Ken, of when it absolutely positively has to be there on time. I do feel like that the FedEx people come through in that way, even though that's not the tagline that they continue with today.
Awesome.
What about being a FedEx employee? Like, what is your favorite thing about being a FedEx employee? And maybe some insider baseball for us folks, a fun fact on FedEx.
My favorite thing, and I don't want to just, riff right off of Steve, but it's definitely the people. One of the things I was just talking to a large group this morning, and I says, I fell in love with the fact that we solve really hard problems and we work with incredible people doing it. So that's been those two things have been my favorite part of my career. We were just probably, the unique thing is just this morning I was at a meeting with Fred Smith, he's still our executive chairman, but the founder of FedEx. So we just had our 50th anniversary this year. So we're a 50-year-old company, and our founder is still our chairman, still as passionate as ever. He's the architect of the tremendous culture of FedEx. He's the architect of, thinking of worldwide networks as being the opportunity to connect the world and make things possible that weren't otherwise. So, whether you're an insider or an outsider, Fred's a real, hero, and just seeing him again today and just seeing how passionate he still is amazing.
It's amazing when you see leaders, especially at that level, still very connected to the business. So that's awesome. I mean, you see, when you talk about the people, you see that even being here with your crew, I mean, they've been amazing. So I have to say, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you guys thus far on this alone. But you've had quite a history at FedEx and quite a career. Can you walk us through sort of your career? And you've played a lot of different roles, and how has that fed into your role today?
I was blessed early on. I got to be in such a core part of what this business is. Even back when I was a young guy, I was a software developer, I got to be involved in our operation systems, or specifically our hub systems. And especially, we really major in automated hubs, automated package sortation. So getting to see automation 30 some years ago when we were really pushing the envelope and solving incredible problems, like I said, that was really the beginning of, to me, created the passion that every day matters. And those were challenging times because we were pushing the envelope so much. It wasn't unusual. The phone would ring every night in the middle of the night because we move massive amounts of packages and are busy in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
But from there, I just had more opportunities to, advance in management roles, where I started and really I grew up in the FedEx ground company. And if you think of FedEx, historically it was a very federated, one of the world's big businesses, but truly federated into four main structures. And this year we've announced a new strategy, One FedEx, where we're really operating instead of separate operating companies as One FedEx. But kind of back to your question, as I got to grow up, I eventually became the CIO of FedEx Ground, and then did that for nearly 11 years. Then was also the CIO of FedEx Freight, and then FedEx Express and FedEx Logistics. So the unique part of my career is at one time or another, as we were still large and federated, I was the CIO of each of the operating companies. And then my role over the last 5 years as the executive vice president. So at the CIO level, I was a senior vice president and CIO of each of those. But in the last 5 years, I've been an executive vice president, and my role has been all of the operating companies. And that's why we call it operations technology, originally called it OpCo technology. But so that's kind of the background of how I got from individual companies to really have a global perspective and a global role, as well as looking at all of our operations all around the world.
Yeah, and the One FedEx transformation that's currently happening, how do you think that that's played your experience across, being involved with all the OpCos and now the global remit? How has that really played into the transformation? Would you have approached it differently, do you think, had it not been for the different layers of experience within FedEx?
I would say if Fred Smith were here, or Raj Subramaniam, who is our president and CEO now, I believe they would say this same thing, and that is, the federated model and the specialty and uniqueness we had was so important and such a part of our success to get scale. We are a much smaller enterprise. That individual uniqueness and specialization, what made us the best in every segment, and we grew tremendously. And we grew $50 billion over 20 years. And then during the pandemic, grew another $25 billion. So at that point, we're more than a $90 billion business. And what really happened is now the scale that we've reached offers a lot of synergy of putting things together and running them as one. So the One FedEx strategy is really an output of the success of all the years of growth and getting to the scale we're at now, where we can just drive tremendous efficiencies.
Yeah, and Steve, I want to touch a little bit on your experience as well, because you've been with FedEx working side by side with Ken and all of the teams since 2008. What has your journey been, and what has that looked like in working with FedEx?
It started at the team level, just, help this team in marketing, help this team over here that's trying to pull together some enterprise services, and then grew into the program level where I started working with Ken, and which meant teams of teams. I think that was an important, that beginning was an important part of the journey at FedEx, because, nobody is going to transform an organization all at once, from zero to transformation, right? So we had to have some of those proof points. And so I think that was an important part of the growth. And then within operating companies, Ken being very influential part of driving that transformation within FedEx Ground from a holistic standpoint first. There were other places within FedEx that were transforming teams and programs and specific initiatives, but Ken, had the courage to pitch it to the CEO at FedEx Ground. And that's where we really started to learn and grow and adapt, and then learn some more in terms of what does this thing, what does that transformation look like from an enterprise perspective? Yeah,
and so enterprise agility, enterprise business agility, many different names for it, but what does it specifically mean for FedEx?
Well, I'm going to pile on a little bit to Steve's, description there and answer your question that way, because, there was obviously agile development was attractive around the enterprise in different groups, and driving a form of agility was obviously very attractive. The challenge we had is groups were starting to do it their own way. And so, everybody said we're agile, or we're, doing something as a lean agile enterprise or lean agile group, individual groups, but the uniqueness was expanding everywhere. At FedEx Ground, we decided we were going to really, lead it as a program. we were going to, major in it, not minor in it, we often like to say. And then also, even in the roles, we were going to make them jobs, not assignments. And so, at FedEx Ground, what it meant to us was a consistent one way that we became a lean, agile enterprise. And that's where we started using the term enterprise business agility. Now that was, it's the second largest of the operating companies. It's the largest in transactions. It's the most automated. But having scale there and growing it up, it really took off and it made a difference. We were much, if you think about just the highest level, the principles of, eliminating waste and reducing context switching.
Yes.
That's what we really started to see the benefit. We really started to major in it. And that's where it really got attractive to the enterprise, to the other operating companies and at the enterprise level. And so at that point, so what does it mean, to answer your question specifically, whenever our president and CEO, Raj Subramaniam, whenever he was the COO of the corporation, he kicked off an event with all the CEOs of the operating companies, the COOs, the CIOs, and we all came together and said, this is so powerful, and the opportunities it enables, again, to repeat, to be a lean, agile enterprise, we need to do this consistently. And that's when we created one enterprise business agility group for business and IT to kind of drive it and make it consistent across the enterprise. So what it means to us is truly enterprise business agility across portfolios at the time, across operating companies. And really, if you think of simple as processes, taxonomy, and tooling, being consistent there, and then ultimately looking at the portfolio at the enterprise level as well.
Yeah. So, and I want to point out that, Ken and I had this discussion many times, but there's a big difference between agile in the enterprise, like spread throughout the enterprise, and enterprise business agility, right? And there was a recognized need for some common foundations, which, I work with a lot of companies. I hadn't seen anyone do, and going back to something that Ken said about creating job roles specifically, that showed the investment, right? This was for FedEx Ground, this was 2016, 2017.
Yeah, and very specifically, it was jobs, not assignments. Because what happened is we were just giving people other assignments.
Yeah.
And again, it would wander, But when we knew there was certain things we needed to do, that people needed to be dedicated to it, that's when we started using that term. Is this a job or an assignment?
Yeah.
And when it was a job, we made sure it was a job.
Well, so going back to the FedEx Ground journey, because I think that laid the foundation for the rest of the enterprise at FedEx, right? Ken, you describe it better in the meeting with Henry, who's now retired, Henry Mayer, who was the CEO at the time. Well, I'll let you describe it in terms of him, you saying, I know somebody who can come in and help us.
Yeah. Well, a little backstory on how this came to be is, we were really accelerating again our, capabilities at FedEx Ground, and we were truly lean and agile, operating lean, agile, and everybody was seeing the benefits. It was the kind of thing that team members would be like, wow, is this a better way to work? Or they'd say, I hope we never go back. Or they'd say things like, I feel like a small, nimble company again. And so the positivity was everywhere. However, we had kind of led it from the center up and down, kind of center in. But we hadn't really aligned at the executive level, the senior officer level of FedEx Ground, where everybody's on the same page. And there was really three different opinions of how we should run the FedEx Ground business agility program. And so, because we were having so much success at the engineering and IT level, we were proposing, and it turned into one of those great debates that nobody would agree. And so it was just a very famous meeting that just went bad because everybody had a different opinion. Finally, I said to the CEO at the time, Henry Mayer, I said, everybody has an opinion, but what we need is a common fact base, and from that we can decide. And the only way to do that is to get everybody educated on all the principles of enterprise business agility. And the truth is, I said, I know a guy. And it was Steve, and I was referring to, he's excellent at communicating. Obviously he's a world-class expert in this. He's done it for years, but he's so good at communicating and simplifying it that we could start with the C-level team at FedEx Ground, all the senior officer team. And so we had a meeting. It was a full day meeting, morning till evening. And it was one of the most interesting meetings in my 30 plus year career, because in the morning you could read the body language. Everybody was positioning to their own defensive position. And there was a lot of this, sitting back and, all that. But it was one of those things that I watched by about halfway through the day, around lunchtime and right beyond, everybody's now leaning in. And then as we got into early afternoon, I could see everybody thought, wow, I better be all in on this, because, it was one of those things like, I'm arguing against the laws of physics here,
Yeah.
And so literally by 3 p.m, everybody was like, how do we lead the way with this? So we had, once there was a common understanding of what business agility meant to us and what the benefits are, and really, quite honestly, what we had already done, it just wasn't understood by everybody. So when they seen how powerful it already was, everybody was in from one end to the other. It wasn't a single person, it was an outlier. But then everybody wanted to get in front of the line and say, how do we as a collective senior team lead it more? And that's what it really went to another level. But it was a proven, the processes and everything were very strong by that point. Then we just took it to another level where everybody was on the same page.
Yeah, and to be certain, it was, that day wasn't talking about methodology or process, and it certainly wasn't talking about feelings, right? Which you get sometimes in the Agile
Very
community.
emotional, very people-driven.
But it was very science-based, and that's why I love when Ken says, define the laws of physics, because we laid out in very clear terms the scientific studies that had shown, for example, how multitasking is destroying productivity within the teams and creating a lot of noise and friction within the organization. And that's when everyone started to lean in, right? That's when the CFO starts to say, okay, yes, I want to hear, alternate choices, not and. I remember he said multiple times, I don't want to hear and when you want to do something else. I want to hear, I'm going to do this and not this, right? And even my big surprise from that day was the legal counsel who came to me, while we were eating dinner and said, I think I've got some ideas about how I can, create more throughput in our legal group.
Yeah, it's true. The chief counsel was all in, kind of starting at a Kanban level, right?
Mm-hmm.
How can I look at all my legal demand? This wasn't technology, this wasn't development. He just wanted to, he's seen the principles and how good they were, especially because, think about it, waste and context switching affects them just as much as anybody.
Yeah.
And so when he had seen that, he was all in and wanted it even in his group. So, we had it's the old saying, right? Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts.
I love that saying.
Once the facts were on
that.
the table, you could just see the whole room change, and then it became the opposite. Honestly, the challenge after that was trying to not have it go so fast that we lose the rest of the crowd, the thousands of people that work for us in all these groups.
Yeah.
We had to be very systematic about it. In other words, it wasn't just, a lot of people said, we just need to communicate. Well, it wasn't just communicate, it was organizational change management. We were driving true OCM, and that had to be a real focus for us.
Yeah, and that's one of Accenture's skill sets is the organizational change management and the people side of things. But going back to sort of the reducing context switching, that's painful for me. In my day-to-day, I get a lot of that, and I can only imagine at the FedEx level, like between that and the eliminating waste, how did you actually, how do you quantify the cost of that? And was that part of that meeting because you were being very fact-based? How did you define that?
Yeah, it wasn't in that meeting that day, right? We did establish the fact base. Then the real work began, right?
Yeah.
And there were some meetings that followed on not long after to start to bring everything. And we're sitting at a big table right here, right? It was as if everyone had to bring all their baggage, right? All their work and throw it on the table, essentially. And we did it, of course, in spreadsheets and other tools. But, we saw this huge amount of work, which we compared to a traffic jam, right? And the cars were moving nowhere. And we wanted to compare it to, a NASCAR race with, going 200 miles an hour around the track. And so we had to pick, what is that top priority thing that we want to focus on, that we want to prove this out on. And I remember, without sharing last names, but, me saying, okay, if this one's your top priority, and that, of course, that top priority initiative got identified after probably 2 hours of debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone wanted their thing to be top priority. But I said, if this is top priority, who do we need on that team? If we were out on the playground picking a team, right? And of course, everyone says, well, you need Gary, right? No last names, but the FedExers will know who I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I said, okay. And we kind of formed, what would that team look like? And then we said, okay, now look, there's thousands of people left. What's the next team? And I said, remember, that first team is dedicated. So Gary can't be on the next team. And that's when everyone kind of freaked out. And no, Gary's got to be on everything, right? And then I reminded of the science of it all, right? If Gary's on everything, then everything can only go at the pace of Gary's ability to multitask, right? And so we had some great debates. Of course, when we're starting out, Gary didn't get only assigned to one thing, but we did, successfully create a lot of focus. And those top 2 initiatives, were delivered 11 and 12 months ahead of plan, ahead of what the current plan was.
Yep. Under budget, sooner than scheduled. And we kind of got into a rhythm where we were doing a lot of that. It was a really good time. And I would say, to just kind of stay at the framework level, one of the things I would say, and Steve and I talked about this a lot through the years, but it really mattered. If somebody's driving a transformation like this, one of the things I would advise is, we really talked a lot about the why and the what before we drove into the how. I see a lot of groups that say, hey, we're going to be an agile enterprise, and they just jump into the how.
Yep.
But we really want it at the why and the what level, and that's kind of where Steve came in and we were talking about. Now, as he said, as we started to get to the how and we started to, win in select areas, then it became a true, organizational change management activity to do it the right way and be more consistent. And we had a lot of there's a lot of stories we could tell, but there was a lot of times where we were looking, so when we started expanding it around the enterprise, we're in the other operating companies or sub-operating companies, subsidiaries of some of the really big operating companies. And we would see where they had these prioritization lists that literally, I could just think of one example, it had 198 things on it, so as ridiculous as that was.
Yeah.
So we basically said, your prioritization method really is, and we had a decibel meter, it was whoever was the loudest, right?
Right.
And, you see that that's not unusual, right, in enterprises. And so, that's where, to Steve's point, that's when we really started to drive the how. And, and kind of who owns it and how we govern it and, how we manage in that portfolio. And then at a complex corporation like FedEx, where we have worked across those portfolios, how do we manage that? And so, it just got, the how really got better and better as we went. Single opco, multiple opcos, enterprise.
And so there's just so much to pick out in all of this. I want to go back to the pandemic, though, because $50 billion to get, the first 20 years of FedEx, and then literally in 2 years, another $25 billion.
Yeah, well, really, it was the prior 20. I mean, the company was already 47 years old, but prior 20 was a $50 billion of growth, and in 2 years we grew $25 billion.
Yeah, and so, what role did Agile play in supporting that growth, or what was that like?
Even in FedEx, I'm not sure how many people would really understand this, but it played a tremendous role. And it really had a lot to do with our cadence of, 10-week PIs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, you're planning every 10 weeks.
Yep.
And you're pooling work, right, into each of these release trains. And so we had to be more nimble than ever. In the old days, when it was this heavyweight context switching, it would have been devastating.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that the cadence is a planning cadence in 12 weeks, and we do architecture, business architecture, and IT architecture. We have a regular decomposition process, right? So the fact that we are decomponentizing all the work at the portfolio level, and we replan every 10 weeks, and we can pool art by art, as the context switching went crazy, because it was just such a time that things were different by week, then our ability to be nimble and change and pivot to the most important things and deliver them quickly, even occasional sideways demand within a 10-week PI, that skyrocketed, but the waste didn't skyrocket. It was just very efficient. We could replan and utilize the arts as they were established, again, in the Scrum, down to the Scrum team level. Teams that are together and experts in these domains could pool work and get things done really rapidly. And that was a key to the pandemic. If it was the old days of toe tagging people's names to projects, and every time if you were going to move those resources to go do other things, there was so much waste. it just wouldn't have been possible. But the reality of it is, and even at the chairman level, he was creating, we basically started a Kanban just of the things that were urgent that were changing on the Friday, was called the Strategic Management Committee. And that list got pretty intense in the early days of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And we were able to pivot and get a lot done in the early days of the pandemic.
Whenever something is hard in life, the way to make it not as hard is to do it more often, right? And so instead of, I think that's what contributed to that organizational muscle memory, is Ken always use that term, muscle memory, right? When the stresses come, what do you turn to, right? You turn to what you're most accustomed to. And I think that was the strength, is there had been so much repeating of the habits, the new habits that were intentionally designed. So in that meeting that Ken described earlier, with all the CEOs coming together and saying, this is something we're going to do, they all signed a poster from with the quote that Dottie had made up, right? Of Charles Duhigg's quote from his book, The Power of Habit, saying there are no organizations without institutional habits, only places where they are, intentionally designed, or where they arise without forethought and therefore come from rivalry and fear. And I'm sure I messed up the quote, but that was what, that was the essence of it. And they all said, we will intentionally design those habits, right? And that repetition of those things really proved out in that pandemic, even in just that 2 months, right? The ability to replan and repace.
And there's a couple of things we're fortunate. We had been doing this at FedEx Ground for years by this point, and it was super strong.
Yeah.
But the fact that Raj and Rob Carter had really stressed the need to drive an enterprise level of this probably 2 years prior to the pandemic, by then the muscle memory and the consistency across the enterprise was pretty strong. And that, I would say that was lucky timing to a degree. And that really helped us in the pandemic. And then, the other thing is, even our, methodologies and cadences were becoming consistent, because we even had inconsistencies of sprint cycles and PIs, but we were on, everybody was a 2-week sprints, 10-week PIs, because we had so much work, especially in the pandemic, that started crossing portfolios where we needed 2 or more portfolios to really deliver together. But that cadence, aligning that cadence, became, originally we didn't even think it was as important. We thought, okay, even if they're 10-week PIs, can the PIs be cycled off, different cycles? But fortunately for us, the alignment of those, we were super nimble to change and delivered rapidly.
Yeah, one thing that we hear a lot about is, it sounded like that meeting that you referenced earlier was really critical in getting, the executives bought in on the getting aligned and getting clarity, right? How do you drive accountability? Because that's a really important component as well. Once you get the clarity and alignment, how do you have all of these executives showing up in an accountable fashion?
It's a great question, and I'll go back. I'm going to repeat, but we definitely, it was kind of like understanding the physics of it. It was the why and the what. Everybody was good there. As we started to get into the how, everybody was committed. Some were more studious than others, right? Some really understood it. And so I think what it became is a really good partnership, that there was a lot more trust. And so, there was a group that was, there was an enterprise business agility function that was owned by one senior vice president in the business and one senior vice president in IT. I happen to be the IT. So there was that, there was 2 people, I hate to use this first among equals, but really we were leading it and running it. And there was a lot of trust with our partners that they see how the process worked, and they were committed to the governance and the decision making. And so, the reality is, at that point, it was where the processes, the taxonomy, consistent wording, what we call it, and the tooling started to become really valuable. And even things like, as that matured, things like seeing flow metrics and stuff really helps everybody go to the next level. So I know I'm not directly answering your question. I would say, it was a 2-tiered. There was those who were directly responsible to run it, drive the change, get the consistency, ensure we have all the metrics of that. Those who trusted and then engaged. And that's kind of how we ran it. But that was really the change management part of this.
Yeah.
I'll add on to that. It took time, and Ken's absolutely right. In the beginning, it had to be relied on, those who leaned in further, But over time, that enterprise business agility group, along with leadership, established patterns that would be consistent at the portfolio level. Then there became these more formalized forums where that accountability would take place, right? Because you had to show up, and we made it very visible. Ultimately, these forums were not driven by PowerPoint slides. They were driven by live views of the data.
Yep.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, which is better for everybody, but it was very much a cultural shift, right? And that became a great forum for that accountability that you were asking about.
Yeah, I think we were just sitting in a round table in New York, and people talked about when you show a report, everyone wants to see now their data in that way. So that kind of touches on that for me. So another thing I wanted to touch on was you talked about people, process, taxonomy, and then OCM, or the org change management. At one point, you had to make a conscious decision to narrow down on those, right? What was that like for you?
Well, early on, it was even a little different. We, at FedEx Ground, when we decided we're going to major in this and we're going to drive this, originally, there's a couple of things that are interesting. One is, talk about how old habits die hard. We originally were running it as an old project management kind of group. We were managing it as a waterfall delivery. So that, as crazy as it sounds, to drive ourselves to be, to drive a business agility program at Ground, we're managing it and all of a sudden we're like, whoa, we need to eat our own dog food. So we literally structured it and ran it like it was an art with sprints and 10-week PI. And so, even the change management and driving this, we ran as an agile, process. But then we really got down to where there was kind of 4 areas of change we needed to lead. It was people, process, architecture. And originally we said communication. So we had 4 teams. We had an IT officer and a business officer in charge of each. So there was partners. And people was easy. That one wasn't easy. It was a lot of change, but it was really clear. There's new roles, right? Titles, roles, things that are jobs on assignments. Let's change those. And oh, by the way, just because somebody was a project manager doesn't make them a scrum master, right? So that was what the people team was focused on. The process, again, was everything from the cadence to, at the time, as we were establishing a value stream structure, you can't just call it a value stream and go start up. There was a whole structure of starting up and running. Architecture was really one of the wild ones, and that was because we knew business architecture was a key success factor. But at the time, architecture was believed to be just an IT job. Mm-hmm. There was no business architecture function. But the business started to establish individual business architecture roles, and then positions with titles, and then ultimately a group, a specialized portfolio level group of business architects. So again, we drove the consistency and the alignment of business architecture and the technical architecture side of IT roles. And then so that became very successful as well. And then the last one, we thought, well, you got a program, you're driving change, you need to communicate a lot. And we realized early on communicating wasn't what we were after. It was OCM. It was organizational change management. You think of an ADCAR process, it was something, we needed that kind of change management. And so we drove that whole team as an OCM group. So once we got that, and that was our own, it wasn't like that was something out in the industry or anything, and we kind of came to it with Steve and as a team. It was our own inside methodology, but it was, what's change mean to your enterprise? To us, people were really important. We had to change the processes. We knew we were going to win or lose on architecture, because I still believe, and Steve and I may even disagree sometimes on this, I still believe one of the dangers, and depending how you define being a lean agile enterprise and how you adapt it, is, some people say you're only doing a 2 PI, architectural, runway. And in the complexity of what we do and the whole city planning concept of architecture, we need both. And so architecture had to be a major for us, and then the OCM part. So point is, we came to it on our own, but it became a super powerful model. And it didn't have to stay along like that forever. Once we were up and running, we began to evolve that away. And that was, again, at OpCo level. Now, what you may have been referring to a little bit earlier, too, in the way you set this up is, once we took it then to the enterprise level, we were trying to drive this at an enterprise level, we got down to a construct. And by the way, I will say this is a typical mistake, happens everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's great people with great intentions, When we started taking it at the enterprise level, we started trying to do everything. You know, it was like, we're going to solve all the world's problems. And that became a mistake, and it really sputtered for a while. And what we did is I called it stop, drop, and roll. We just got to stop, drop, and roll. And we got to simplify. And we got it down to really, we're focused on just 2 things, and there's just 3 processes in each. We're going to be, lean portfolio management. Lean portfolio management to us was processes, taxonomy, and tooling.
Yeah.
We got to define that consistently. And then once we get that, we have a consistent way, process, taxonomy, and tooling for the enterprise, then we're going to drive to enterprise portfolio management. And that is, in our OpCo structure, we had portfolios up and running and strong by OpCo, but we didn't have one for the enterprise, a horizontal. And in that, we really knew we needed a couple things. And one of them is, well, if you're going to have an enterprise portfolio, what are your enterprise strategic initiatives? We call them ESIs. And that was the number one. We had to get ESIs. And then we truly had to have an enterprise portfolio and start that up. So anyhow, sorry for the long part of this, but it really was what we had to do at the infancy at the OpCo level to drive that people, process, architecture, and OCM, set the table to take it to the enterprise level. But then at the enterprise level, it started to get unruly because everybody was trying to do everything. We stop, drop, and roll, simplified it down to those 2 things. And boy, then it really took off. And to this day, our enterprise business agility team, and even we have a new vice president that took it over a couple of years ago and hadn't even come from this background, but he's an engineering background and, super smart, super aggressive, engaged with the team. And they went all in on a simplification methodology, really. And the pace and the change and the influence they have today is amazing.
Yeah, it's a different mindset. I remember, Ken, when you used that stop, drop, and roll, it was like, there's so many things we need to do to transform, right? We use that word transform, and I think sometimes the organization becomes tired of it.
The most overused term in business today is we're transforming,
And the power of simplifying it was to adopt more of a mindset of better every day, right? And I love better. I love the phrase, better is better than best.
Yeah.
Right. Because when you're trying to go for best, you lose sight, I think, sometimes. And when you're just saying, we want to improve. And so what Ken helped the organization do, including those of us that were coaching, gave us the freedom to not try to do everything.
Yeah. Progress over perfection.
Right. But to narrow in on, here's the steps we're going to take now. And once those are established, then we're going to take another and then continue on.
Yeah, and I'm a traditional software developer background. I'm a math and science guy, right? And I believe in the powers of 3s, and literally, if I said we're fighting 20 things, I was probably underestimating. And when I really started to re-engage with the enterprise team more broadly, I'd always had a role, but there was a partnership role, and I got more of the responsibility of it. I thought, okay, well, let's see how I can help. And I was literally blown away by all the things we were trying to do. And so, I said, it's a 2x3. I kind of called it a 2x3. There's 2 really big things that if we win those, we truly have enterprise business agility at what we need, the power we need at the enterprise. And in there's 2 sets of 3. And we had to win lean portfolio management first. If you don't have that, and it sounds funny, but even things like taxonomy, value stream, domains, all these terms that we all know, they were just being interpreted, even where they weren't completely defined differently, they were being interpreted differently.
Yeah.
And so we really got disciplined about that. And, disciplined, like, write it down. Like, here's what it is.
Ken had a famous phrase, words matter.
Yeah, we say that a lot. Right? That's what, I learned that a long time ago. I was one of those, I think I was like a director and officer like decades ago, and our former COO, I'm sitting in a meeting and we're going through, he says, wait a minute, time out. Words matter. And I was one of those it hit me that day, and I was like, boy, is he right? If you're trying to lead people to change, words really matter. And so on our enterprise business agility team, we talked a lot about that. Words matter. And just that taxonomy part of it, everybody started to skyrocket when there's a common definition, skyrocket the progress when there was a common understanding and definition.
Yeah.
So true in that everyone's interpreting a word the same exact way in any organization. I mean, that's critical. And so I just wanted to get your take on sort of your strategy around common LPM and what, if you could touch on that a little bit more.
Well, Alexis, you said it perfect because you said common LPM. When I described it earlier, I said we started to drive towards, we wanted, LPM, lean portfolio management. And right away we realized, no, that's not what we want. We want common lean portfolio management across the enterprise. So that was the key part of the name. But, and I guess the right way to say this, what it meant to us is, we really, there was an offensive and a defensive position. The defensive position is we needed to stop all the different interpretations and all the different models that were running across the different portfolios. Offensively then, when we were more aligned, cross-portfolio work would move much better, much more consistently. That where we had cross-portfolio work is where we tended to struggle before. So what it really, meant to us was that, we had to get, again, processes, taxonomy, and tooling. What we had to do is align on the common processes, okay? Mm-hmm. And this is literally from architectural decomposition, portfolio level, but consistent processes all the way down through. And so what it means to us is if you look at SAFe, and again, we kind of have, and Steve will talk to this better than I will, we kind of have, we love SAFe, right? And we've been a proponent of it even as it's gone through to, different versions, but we kind of had to interpret it as SAFe for FedEx, okay? And so it was really important for us that we didn't chase each, different version, because sometimes the taxonomy, and it was even different enough that it was causing confusion in FedEx. So we took the best of it and just made it like FedEx certified each time. That was an example. And so now the whole common lean portfolio management process, there is each portfolio has a representative in the committee that drives this, and we all make sure everybody agrees. And if we don't, if there's any non-agreement, it's not that we're looking for consensus, but we're making sure that there's nothing that's going to harm us, and everybody gets input and everybody gets a vote. And so that is another part of it. So, again, process taxonomy and tooling, it's each of the portfolios have a stake in it. One of the things when we had the first release of common lean portfolio management, we understood that everybody's already running how they're running. We gave them to the end of that calendar year to adopt it. They can adopt it at, at their cadence and at their pace. And so it wasn't like forcing it down somebody's throat. It was, what is it? How do we change to it? And then that drove a lot of the work across the enterprise.
Yeah, I know. In reference to SAFe and then the common lean portfolio management, what really created success without what commonly comes up within organizations is this religious debate. At FedEx was Ken and many of the other leaders that he influenced saw SAFe for what it was, which is a framework. It's not a prescription. It's not a religion, right? It's a framework. And in any good framework, you select the patterns and practices that are going to work for you, and you make it yours. Now, what's different then about common LPM was it had to be a bit prescriptive. So, so much of the success too, we haven't talked about, is the creation of this formalized VP champions group, as we called it, of business and IT leaders working together on a regular cadence to review, debate, prioritize, and then drive adoption of these common terms, right? And that became an important part of it. And then it did have to be the same, right? I think too often organizations get weighed down by some internal struggle and religious debate around SAFe or not SAFe or something else. SAFe's not out there trying to tell people what to do. They're trying to say, hey, here's some patterns and practices that have worked within organizations, and you should consider them. And that's what Ken did very successfully.
Yeah, and I'm a software guy in my background, right? And platforms win and frameworks win, right? So and I use that a lot, right? And I'm like, platforms win and frameworks win. So we used it as the framework it was, and the power of it, absolutely. But we made it for FedEx. And that's where, and again, that VP champion program, another group, really good people, really committed to it, but passionate. Early on, everybody had their own reason why it needed to be a little bit different. But ultimately, by really working together and just being relentless, everybody came aligned, and at least we agreed to align. And then we agreed to the process to change so that everybody could, work consistently. And that was really important. Obviously, that's a VP group. Our VP groups are very large, really, powerful groups. But, I'm an executive vice president, so my direct reports are all senior vice presidents. But I would meet with that VP group regularly. I would, I get, still to this day, get with them frequently, because I just wanted, if we were really going to lead the way and influence it, I really wanted to hear consistently, again, kind of the why and the what they believed how we should change. And again, we can't get to consensus all the time, but you can get to alignment, So we drove to have an alignment. We didn't have to drive towards consensus.
Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us for Tough Conversations with CxOs, a podcast from Atlassian and Accenture. Thank you as well to our special guest, Ken Spangler of FedEx, for sharing his insights today. You can check out more about Ken, as well as the work Atlassian and Accenture are doing on enterprise agility, using the link in our show notes. We'll be back with more conversations soon. Follow us now on your podcast app, and you won't miss an episode.